Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in Los Angeles, California. How is everybody doing today? I hope you're well, I hope you're happy, I hope you're healthy, I hope you're doing something fun. Today in our Critter Chat, we're going to talk about an amazing animal, one that has fascinated me for years. Today, we're going to talk about orangutans. Now notice I didn't say orangutan. There's no G at the end. So it's orangutan is the spelling and the pronunciation. That word's an interesting word. It is derived from a Malay word, which is a language spoken on the other side of the world in Malaysia. The word it's derived from is orangutan with an H in the middle. And hutan means forest, and orang means person. So the word orangutan or orangutan means person of the forest. And it's a really good description of them. Traditionally, people in Indonesia and Malaysia, where orangutans live, thought that they were actually people out there in the forest that were trying to avoid doing the work of the village and were kind of sneaking around and watching the others work. But orangutans actually share 97% of our same DNA. So that's pretty darn close to being a human. They live on two islands, very, very large islands, Borneo and Sumatra. And those islands are across the Pacific Ocean from here, located in the countries of Indonesia and Malaysia. Those islands are both really close to the equator, and historically those islands were covered with rainforest. And that is where the orangutans find their home. However, the forest is disappearing, and so are orangutans, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. Orangutans are the largest arboreal or tree-dwelling animal or mammal on the earth. So they're the biggest mammal that lives in trees, and they spend up to 80% of their time in trees, with one species, the Sumatran orangutans, actually spending about 90% of their time in the trees. They are very adapted to living in trees and sometimes are 120 feet up off the ground. So they are very, very good at living in the trees. With orangutans, the females are about a third or half the size of the males. So the females, if they were standing, they're about 45 inches tall. The males are about 54 inches tall. And the females weigh anywhere between 80 to 110 pounds. The males weigh about 180 to over 200 pounds. Now sometimes their counterparts in zoos weigh more because they get a little less extra exercise and a little more treats. Males and females also look quite a bit different. The males are, as I mentioned, bigger, but an adult male that's sexually mature usually has very large cheeks, big kind of pads on the side of his face. And for a long time, scientists didn't really know what that was for. They kind of have different theories of what that may be. Some say it's to help them look bigger and more impressive to females, which is probably the prevalent theory today. They also sometimes fight with each other, and those big cheek pads are nice and thick, so it may protect their vital neck and face areas a little bit better. Male orangutans also have a huge arm span. So my arm span from one tip to the other tip is just about 6 feet, but orangutans have a 7-foot arm span. So from tip to tip, if they stretch out their arms like this, 7 feet for a male orangutan. But they're quite a bit shorter than I am, coming in at about 4.5 feet tall. So they have really big arms compared to how tall they are. That makes them kind of look awkward sometimes on the ground, and if they stand up like I'm standing, their hands go all the way almost to the floor because their arms are so long. Those big arms help them to be able to really climb well when they're moving through the forest and moving through the trees. And it's very important to them for helping them find their food. The male orangutans also typically have very long hair. Once they get old enough, their hair on their arms and on their back grows super long and kind of looks like a cape. That makes them look even bigger. In the wild, they typically can live to be about 35 or 40 years old, maybe mid-40s if they're really lucky. And in a zoo setting, they can often live into their 50s, with a couple individuals reaching 60 years old. So that's kind of the record, is 60 years old. But that's a pretty long lifetime, and that's important too because they spend a lot of their lifetime as a child. They are known as having the longest childhood of any animal out there. A baby orangutan typically spends about 7 or 8 years with his or her mom, learning how to be an orangutan. So their gestation period, their pregnancy, starts between about 8 and 9 months, so not all that different from humans, with babies being born at about 3 to 4.5 pounds in size. So they're pretty small babies. They typically will be held by their mom and kind of cuddled against her belly when they're infants, and as they start to get a little older, they'll start to ride on her back. And then when they're about 3 or 4 years old, they can kind of move on their own, but they stay very close to mom. During that time, she teaches them all the different things they need to know to be an orangutan, because they're largely solitary. So they're usually alone most of their lives, other than a mom with her baby, or when they come together to breed, or possibly if there's a really big tree with lots of really ripe fruit, there may be several that come together to eat off of that tree at one time, but they typically don't live in a group. They typically live by themselves. And with that, they kind of have to know a lot of different things. They have to know kind of the map of their forest. So they live in a home range that is typically about 3 square miles or so for a female, and up to maybe 15 square miles for a male. And his territory would overlap several females' home ranges. So they would kind of know who he is, and he may see them on occasion, but they may keep their distance pretty well too. Out there in the forest, they eat over 300 different kinds of plants. And of those different plants, they eat different parts of some of them. So some plants they might eat fruit from, but they would also eat like the leaves or the flowers. And other plants they may eat the fruit, but also the bark. And some plants they'll only eat the leaves, and some plants they'll eat the little stems, and some plants they'll eat only the bark. But they are very adaptive at finding food in the rainforest, and they've documented, like I said, over 300 types of food that they eat, which is pretty incredible, including on rare occasion insects. So that's pretty rare, but it does happen. Now, to find all this food and to live this life in the trees, they have really long arms. They also have really long fingers, quite a bit bigger than ours. The big male orangutans have a finger, like their index finger, would be about the size of a hot dog bun, and about that big around too. So it's like a hot dog bun for each finger for a big male. And the female's fingers are still bigger than mine. Their hands are huge. In addition to that, their big toe works like a thumb. So they can actually hold things with their feet as well as their hands. So they almost have 4 hands instead of 2 hands and 2 feet. And with their foot, they can actually grab onto a branch and help hold themselves while they're picking fruit or climbing around in the trees. So pretty cool that they have an opposable big toe. That means they can grab things with their foot. Up in the forest, they have a very special, they learn their area where they live, and they learn what trees are gonna have ripe fruit at what time, or when the leaves are gonna be best to eat from that tree or this tree, and what time of year all those things ripen. And they kind of store all that up in their head. They are really, really smart and really good at remembering things, and that helps them throughout their life to find their food. They are also experts at building a nest. So they sometimes will build 2 nests every day, a daytime nest that they'll take a nap in during the warmest part of the day, like now in the mid-afternoon, and then another nest sometimes for sleeping. Now they'll sometimes reuse a nest if that works, but some days they move too far and they'll make a whole new nest to sleep in. If it's raining, they will also usually make or find an umbrella. And by that, it's usually a big leaf, like a big palm frond. And they'll hold it over their head, or they'll balance it on top of their head to keep them dry. Sometimes if they know it's gonna rain for a lot of days on end, they'll build a roof over their nest to help keep them drier. Now, in addition to that, they have really long hair on their arms, and the hair on this side of their arm all kind of grows down this way, and the hair on this side of their arm grows down towards the elbow too. So if they sit like this, the water from the rain that hits their arms, both on the shoulder and their hand, would run towards the elbow and then drip off of them. So they're pretty well adapted to living in a rainforest as well. Now, interestingly, in 2017, the science world confirmed what several people had thought for quite a while. For a long time, they had thought that there were 2 kinds of orangutans, Bornean and Sumatran. And in 2017, they officially declared that there is a 3rd kind. And that 3rd kind is called Tapanuli orangutans. And they were officially declared a separate species in 2017 by the scientific community after extensive genetic testing. They found that the Tapanuli orangutans are actually the oldest of the 3 species, and unfortunately they are also the most rare, with an estimated population of only about 800 individual Tapanuli orangutans. Now, the Sumatran and Bornean orangutans are also quite rare, and all 3 species are listed as critically endangered. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Let's talk a bit about how they're different from each other, the 3 species. So Sumatran orangutans typically are a little more orange in color. They sometimes have very light reddish hair, very orangey colored, and the female Sumatran orangutans usually have a beard as well as the male. The Bornean orangutans are a little darker color red, so they're sometimes almost a maroon color, and the females typically don't have as much of a beard. Now, these new orangutans, the Tapanuli orangutans, they actually have slightly smaller skulls. Their face is a little more narrow. Their eyes are closer together, and their hair is more cinnamon color. And it's also thicker hair and a little more frizzy hair. And they live in a very isolated population in Sumatra. So they're pretty far away from the other orangutans that live on Sumatra. Now, those islands, like I said, are huge, but habitat fragmentation is a big part of the problem with orangutans. So let's talk a little bit about how smart they are. With them staying with their mom a long time, a big part of that built-in skill is to observe and to learn things. That's why once they're about 2 years old, they climb onto their mom's back as she moves through the forest so they can see where they're going. And they're very active during the daytime, and that's when they are looking for their food. They sleep during the night. And so they spend that time learning their forest home and what fruits and plants are good to eat and when. Now, that observation skill comes in handy in other times too, as an adult. They've observed a female orangutan over in Indonesia, lives right along the edge of a really big river. And her territory is actually on both sides of the river. Orangutans are not good swimmers. They usually are scared of the water. They don't go in the water very often. There's a crocodile species that lives in the forest there, and so they would be pretty scared to go into the water because that may be their only real predator, is this crocodile type species. And like I said, they don't swim very well. So this orangutan, who had a territory on both sides of the river, watched the people. and she watched them with a little canoe, and they had a dock on each side of the river, and they would come down and untie the boat and go out into the canoe to fish or to cross the river. She learned how to do that, and she would often borrow their boat. And so she would go down to the dock when they weren't around, untie the boat, and use the boat to go across the river and tie it up on the other side so that the boat would still be available for her to come across later. Now, she didn't use the paddle to paddle the boat. She would paddle with her arms out the sides of the canoe. But she was very quick to learn, this boat that these humans use, that could be helpful to me. And she was able to use that in her moving around. Now, sometimes their observation and their intelligence shows up in orangutans in zoos. And if you talk to anybody who's worked in a zoo, and if you ask if animals escape, and if animals do escape, often those are orangutans. They're very good at problem solving because they also live their life in solitary a lot out in the wild. It's built in for them to be very observant and to think through a problem. They're not going to be risky. They're not going to take a lot of chances because there's nobody else out there to help them. There's not a family member or a friend who's going to bring them food if they get hurt or if they get stuck or get injured. So they think things through very well, and they're able to problem solve very well. So two orangutans that were notoriously famous for escaping their exhibits in zoos. One, they were both big male orangutans. One lived at the San Diego Zoo. His name was Ken Allen. He unfortunately passed away of cancer in the year 2000, but he was an expert at figuring out new and different ways to get out of his exhibit during his time at the San Diego Zoo. And they usually were very easy to lead him back into his exhibit, but they would kind of have to watch and figure out and send the night watch person or the night keeper over to watch to see how he was getting out. And then they would modify the exhibit, and he would find another way out, and another way, and another way. He became so famous that people actually wrote stories and songs and poems about his ability to escape and his ability to think through the problems. Really fun stories. If you want to look anything up, look up Ken Allen, San Diego Zoo orangutan. Now, at the San Diego Zoo, when Ken Allen lived there, that orangutan exhibit is no longer. They built a new one since he passed away. And when they were building the new exhibit, the orangutans from the San Diego Zoo moved over to their sister facility, the San Diego Safari Park. And during that time, they kept them in the, they had a big great ape room at the hospital, for the animal hospital at the San Diego Safari Park. And they had successfully had chimpanzees there, or bonobos actually, bonobos and gorillas in that room before. They're like, oh, the orangutans can live in the great ape holding, it will be fine. Well, every morning they would come in, and orangutans in zoos are often trained that if they find something, they can bring it to their keeper and trade it for a treat. And that's a good way of helping a smart animal to give back something that they shouldn't have. If it falls in their exhibit or something gets left in their exhibit while they're cleaning, they can trade it back to hopefully get it safely back. Well, these orangutans at the San Diego Zoo, who had moved to the San Diego Safari Park Hospital, every morning they would come over to the gate where the keepers would say hello, and they would hold out their arms like, oh, hey, I have something to trade you. And the keeper would hold out their hand, and the orangutan would drop into their hand bolts and nuts, screws from the building. And they didn't really know where they were coming from. They didn't know what they were doing to take them apart, but they started to look very closely at the room that they lived in. And although it had ceilings about 10 feet high and nothing climbing structure-wise in the middle, they were taking the bolts out of the vents of the air conditioning unit and of the light fixtures. So they actually mounted a camera in there, and the next day, when the keepers came in, they had taken the camera down and were trading the camera. And sometimes they will often break things into multiple pieces, so they can give one piece and get a treat, and then give the other piece and get a treat. So often things don't survive an orangutan's strength if it gets traded for treats. So they eventually figured out how to do that, and they ended up welding the bolts and nuts in place to prevent them from taking apart the air conditioning vents in their time at the San Diego Safari Park Hospital. There was another very famous orangutan that was great at escaping. He lived at the Omaha Zoo, the Henry Dorley Zoo in Omaha, and his name was Fu Manchu, and he actually, I don't believe, is alive anymore as well. But he was a very good escape artist as well. He would figure out different ways to get out of his exhibit, mostly by taking apart the air conditioning vent and going through the vents, and then taking it apart on the other end and going kind of out to a keeper access area. And then he would pick a lock and let himself out the door and go outside at night and be sitting in the trees outside his exhibit, outside the building, in the morning when the keepers would come in. And that was happening over and over again, so they put up cameras to monitor him to figure it out. And the thing they really couldn't understand for a long time is how he was getting through the locked door. Well, Fu Manchu had taken apart a light fixture, and in that light fixture he took apart a piece of wire, and he put the wire and hid it in his mouth between his teeth and his cheek. And every night he would pull that wire out of his mouth and use it to pick the lock. Now, how he learned to pick the lock, they still don't understand, but he was very good at problem solving and escaping from his exhibit. So next we're going to talk a little bit about the threats that face wild orangutans. They live in a rainforest, and that rainforest is on, like I said, 2 big islands in Indonesia and Malaysia. Those are very big countries with a lot of people, and they are not, they're kind of poor countries. They struggle with a lot of different things. They struggle with enforcing laws, and some people in those countries really struggle to make ends meet or to safely live a decent life. And because of that, even though there are protections in place for the forest and in some of the preserves and national parks, it's often illegal logging, and cutting down trees in the forest is a big part of the problem. Now, it's not just cutting down trees. These are big rainforest trees, so they're sometimes 200 feet tall, and they're hundreds of years old. And as they're cutting those down, they use that to sell for lumber around the world, especially any of the tropical hardwoods that are really beautiful woods to use, like teak or rosewood, ipe, mahogany. All of those come from the tropics. So they're very beautiful woods, but they can be very destructive if not sustainably harvested. Also, Indonesia leads the world in producing paper and paper products, including toilet paper. And so our craziness here in the US with our shortage of toilet paper is probably fueling additional forest destruction over in Indonesia. And that's a problem that we could all do a little better on. Earlier in another Critter Chat, I posted things about the Forest Stewardship Council, the FSC. They have a little logo of a tree with a green check mark by it. That's an easy way we can all help out as we buy paper or wood. Make sure it's sustainably harvested. But even just aside from the deforestation, cutting down the trees, there's a bigger underlying problem with that, and that's the land in Indonesia is perfect for growing a certain type of crop. And that crop is called palm oil. Palm oil grows on big palm trees. They get these little berries on them. And if you squeeze the berry, you get some oil out of it, kind of like an olive oil. But the palm oil trees are not native to Indonesia. They're actually from Africa, from West Africa. But it is now the #1 consumed food oil in the world. And it's common in a lot of ingredients and in foods that we buy here in the United States. Although it has changed a bit. It's in a lot of candy and stuff now, and in some cosmetics and toiletries. palm oil, sometimes called palmate or palm kernel oil. That's all the same thing. And an easy way you can help out is by making sure items you purchase either don't have palm oil in them or that it's sustainably harvested. Sometimes they'll grow these palm oil trees, then they just cut down the tree, harvest the oil because that's easier than picking the fruits. And then they'll grow new ones, and that's not a very sustainable practice. And they often are cutting down more forests to grow more trees all the time. There is a good resource for that. There's an organization called the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, and the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo in Colorado Springs, Colorado, has put together a little information about palm oil and how we can all help out in purchasing better palm oil. I'll put a link up to their palm oil website later today, but that's a really good resource to help us all do better with palm oil. The third big threat for orangutans is the pet trade. So baby orangutans are adorable, they're really cute, they're amazing to watch, but they belong with their mother. Unfortunately, there are people that think that they're so cute that they should have them as a pet, and that is a terrible, horrible idea. They're gonna grow up to be a big orangutan, and then they're not gonna be a very good pet anymore. Even a female orangutan is incredibly strong. She could cause serious body harm to people. They have very sharp teeth, strong jaws, strong arms, strong fingers. A male orangutan could probably rip an arm off of a human if they felt the need to. So they grow up to be very big, powerful animals. They are not good pets. Also, for capturing a baby orangutan to sell into the pet trade, the mother orangutan is often killed, and that causes problems with the population in general. I mentioned earlier that orangutans have one of the longest childhoods of all animals out there. Typically, it's at least 4 to 6 years between births of a single mother. So if she has a baby, she won't have another one till that first baby's 4 if everything goes great and if there's lots of food. It may be 5 years or 6, sometimes even 8 if there's a little bit of stress in the environment. If there's a drought, if there's a fire, if there's flooding that causes delays or problems with the food availability, then she'll wait even longer before reproducing. But if you take a female orangutan out of the wild or kill it to get its baby, you've now not only hurt her, but any of the potential babies she could have had during her lifetime. Now, there are some people out there helping and doing some really good work. And today we have 2 special shout outs of conservation organizations that are helping. One is the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo. They are the leaders in figuring out this palm oil trade and how to do so safely without hurting orangutans and many, many other animals that live in those forest settings. So I'll post stuff up from them later. The other is a conservation organization called HUTAN. That's part of orangutan's original name is orangutan, and Hutan means forest. And they're a conservation organization working in Borneo on the Malaysian side of the island, specifically working to help protect the orangutans, the Bornean pygmy elephants, and many other animals that live in that forest setting. They do some really great work with trying to reclaim land that was used for agriculture and replant it with the native trees that would live there in the rainforest, and also connecting habitat fragmentation. So we've talked about habitat fragmentation a bit before. That's where this little group of animals and this little group of animals can no longer get back and forth to each other because there's a road or a city, a village, or a big field of farmers' crops or something in the way. And what Hutan does is they help to plant rainforest trees along the edges of those properties so that there's a wildlife corridor so these animals and these animals can get to each other again and improve the breeding and genetic opportunities. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with orangutans. Most of my experience with orangutans came when I worked at the Phoenix Zoo in Arizona. I worked in the education department there, and about a year, maybe a year and a half into my employment there, we started a pretty ambitious new project to build some new exhibits at the zoo. And I was selected to represent the education department in the building of a new orangutan exhibit. And with that, I was involved for about 3.5 years, coming up with initial concepts, working with architects in planning on building it, working a bit with the contractors to build the exhibit. And we had a little team, so I was there representing the public space and the education elements. And we worked with the head orangutan keeper, myself, one of the veterinarians, and then one of the construction guys, the maintenance workers at the zoo. Because I've mentioned how intelligent they are and also potentially how destructive they are, he kind of oversaw all of those elements as the construction happened to make sure we were building an orangutan-proof exhibit to help prevent the orangutans from destroying their new home. But it was a really great opportunity, and one of the biggest highlights of my career was to be involved in building that new project. So we worked through the planning stages. I spoke often at fundraising events and helped secure donations to help pay for the exhibit, as well as working through multiple revisions and processes of what the exhibit would consist of, how it would function, what it would look like, and how it would be used. I was very happy in 2010. We broke ground for that exhibit. And that was also the day that we celebrated the 50th birthday of a very special friend of mine. And she's the orangutan that's featured in the photo that I posted earlier today on Instagram and Facebook. Her name is Duchess, and she is one of my favorite animals I've ever had the chance to know. She was actually born in the wild in Borneo, and then she was brought to the United States between about 1.5 and 2 years old. And she was purchased by the Phoenix Zoo early on, and that was the 1960s, so things functioned very different then as far as where zoos got a lot of their animals from. Today that would not happen. Today zoos trade baby orangutans or baby animals of any kind with other zoos, and it's very rare that an animal comes from the wild in today's zoo setting. But Duchess lived a very long life at the Phoenix Zoo. She was one of the first animals to live at the zoo when it opened in 1962. And during her life there, she gave birth 7 times, which is incredible. And she really helped a lot of people learn more about orangutans. She has 5 offspring that survived, 2 did not. And each of them have gone on to reproduce on their own. So she also now has grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and I've had the opportunity to meet several of them, including the ones that also lived at the Phoenix Zoo. And it was a really great opportunity. Although I was never their caretaker, I did get to know them as individuals. And as an educator, I talked about them every day that I worked, and I would usually spend about an hour to an hour and a half at their exhibit talking to guests and answering questions about them. In doing so, I earned a little bit of respect and trust from the orangutans to where they would feel comfortable sometimes approaching me, especially in their new home once it was completed, like in the photo I posted earlier today. That was the first time I was able to ever be that close to Duchess. Our faces just merely inches apart. And it was a really great opportunity to sit and look into her eyes as she looked into mine. And we just kind of sat there and stared at each other for about 15 minutes. And it was a really amazing experience to kind of share that moment with her. She was very, very curious about the human world and very, very excited to try human things. If you would give her a piece of cloth of any kind, she would dunk it into her water to drink, and she would start cleaning as she saw people clean. So she would clean alongside the people who would keep the windows clean every day. And it was always enjoyable to watch. If you gave her something like a t-shirt or a blanket to play with, she would often put it on and wear it like humans would. And it was very cute to watch. But she was also the leader of her family at the Phoenix Zoo for many, many years. And during her time there, her daughter Bess, who still lives at the Phoenix Zoo, also had a baby named Cassie who lived there, and it was great to watch the interaction of the 3 generations of them, and some of my fondest memories in a zoo setting. Duchess unfortunately passed away at the age of 52, so she did get to see the new exhibit. She lived in it for a time, and we kind of dedicated the central people part of her exhibit in her memory and in her honor. And there was a great timeline created that kind of showed the highlights of her life, as well as the other things going on with the zoo in general during that time. So she is a great friend of mine who I worked with, and I was very, very sad when she passed, but she was very sick with cancer, and we knew it was coming. But orangutans are incredible animals. I'll be posting some videos and some more photos up later today. So check out the Facebook profile to catch in on those. And I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today. I hope you're staying safe, staying home, being happy, and doing something that's fun. Until tomorrow, I will see you then. Take care. Goodbye.